feel like breaking out into song, but I won't inflict it on you. So, yeah. Maybe later. Maybe over a drink later. Good morning, Wellington. It's an absolute pleasure to be here today. I am in that wonderful quandary of moving between companies, and so the introduction was beautifully done because I honestly don't know where I'm going to end up next, but it's quite exciting. And all I can say to people is shout out to the innovation sector because it's growing like topsy. There's great opportunities for people to get involved in it. And I'm very delighted that my career, which has always started in customer, but naturally takes you towards technology with the way that people have changed their lives with technology, changing it in terms of live, work, play. And that sort of generally takes you there anyway. And so today is a bit about my journey, a bit about what I've learnt, and I'm going to start. Oh, I've already started there. So starting with sort of me, age 10, and that was a home haircut, which is unfortunate that that's the only photo that I could find. But, you know, back in the day, it was all about, the introduction of TV in black and white. Watched the introduction of the electronic typewriter, and then the introduction of, the internet. And through that time, you can just sort of get this feeling, this sense of pace taking off and it becoming just faster and faster and faster and harder and harder and harder to get your head around it, to the point where if somebody said, are you a tech person, I would say absolutely not, because there's no way that I could ever be across the breadth of what's going on. So I ground myself back in customer, and we'll keep coming back to that. So woohoo, I had to put a little woohoo in there because we are a standout nation. And that's a pretty exciting position to be in. But when you have a look in that report, you'll see that there are some nations that have stagnated because they get to this plateau and consumer expectations are so high that it's really hard to maintain that pace. And we know that if we want to grow as a nation, that we're going to have to invest in innovation. We're going to have to think about digitising everything and bringing everyone along on that journey, as the Minister was talking about earlier. And it's not easy. There's some crazy big challenges. Everything from the changing climate to we've now got 5 generations of people in the workforce. It is highly likely that great-granddaughters could be working with their grandmothers. Isn't that amazing? And when you think about all of us in this room, retirement is a real big question because how are you going to actually survive for the next, maybe, if you're going to live, if you're of the age of 60 now, potentially you could live to 120. How are you going to fund that? And how are you going to, that's a scary concept. And then when we think about where technology and the pace and the speed of change is going, how do we keep up with that as well? It all seems a bit overwhelming. And then we have other things putting pressure on, like Amazon coming in. And it's not just Amazon, it's actually e-commerce in general, squeezing out that middleman. What does that do for small business in New Zealand? I would be really concerned if I was a middleman. And particularly in retail. So lots of things to think about. Data security. Yep, we know that one. I have to put my glasses on now because I can't see where I am. And just the age of the robots. And I think there's lots of myths in this space in particular because everyone's racing to get a bot. But actually, robots have been in place a long time. And it's really around how do we actually harness that power to augment and work together, man and machine working together. So with all that, though, investing in innovation actually really does work. And we know that businesses that do it achieve. In fact, actually, in the latest Brands Global Top 100, over half of the top 100 were tech companies. They're the Amazons, the Googles and people like that. And they're the ones that are actually charging ahead in terms of both profitability but also just this whole demand piece. So 60% more likely to report increases in income, 4 times more likely to increase the number of exports. It's a bit of a no-brainer. So that's why I've been in the innovation space. At Fonterra, I was the GM of Digital Innovation, and then more recently I was the Chief Innovation Officer at SkyCity. So what I'm going to share with you now is a bit about kind of what I've been doing and what I've found, and also my mistakes, because people come up here and talk about all the good stuff, but I'd rather you learnt from the things I would do differently so that you can take that and not make my mistakes. So at SkyCity more recently, I was brought in to actually set up an innovation team and to think about what is the future of entertainment. And so I had a blank piece of paper. It's fantastic. And I had some questions to answer. If we're thinking about what's the future of entertainment, this is a group that spans Australia and New Zealand, has casinos, has hotels, food and beverage, theatres, bowling alleys, conference centres, and they're actually a venue, really. They're not necessarily an entertainer in themselves, but actually they're in the entertainment business. And so, who is the customer of an entertainment business? What's changing in the way that those customers are living and working and playing? How do we make sure that we stay relevant? What are the outside exemplars? What's happening around the world in this space? How do we take advantage of what's growing? What will that do to our business if they keep growing and keep growing into our space? What will make us fundamentally different and better? What does our business need to look like, therefore? How do we best diversify our offerings, and how do we actually start to bring in new entertainment experiences? How do we empower our staff to be agile and innovative and support change? And, we all say change is great until it starts coming at us, and then we're like, oh yeah, no, that's changed to someone else, not to me. And how do we then avoid the disruption to ourselves, unless, of course, we're managing it ourselves? And then how do we actually sustain and grow? Because there's a lot of stuff that happens that comes at you, go, oh, this is great, but actually it's not sustainable. So how do you actually sort that through, the wheat from the chaff, if you like? So I set up a fit-for-purpose collaboration space, which is a way of bringing a place for people to come together. So drop-down power, you can roll all the tables around, could take up to 60 people, run workshops, bring customers in. It was a suitable space for bringing people from outside in, putting teams together, and then actually setting up the projects around the teams. So the space just is modular for that. It was over the road from the main business, so a short sort of 2-minute walk, if you like. And what I focused on doing was looking at sort of the landscape for entertainment, thinking about, who will our customers be in that future space, then using human-centred design and customer experience and design research to actually start to sort of think about shaping up what these offerings might be, thinking about the connected service as well, so that it's nice and fluid, and then looking at a continuous improvement process. I'll go into a little bit more of that in an example. I had a virtual team, so I actually didn't need much in the way of headcount myself. I had a small team of 5, and then I supplemented that with other people from around the business who were seconded in, and then external partners. So, for example, I used social anthropology to help understand some of the behaviours. I didn't need a social anthropologist on staff, so I freelanced one in. I didn't need a creative technologist all the time. But I did need heavy support from the ICT team, so actually we hybrid team a lot of the work. External partners, customers, very, very important that they're involved right from the beginning. And then externals as well, so thinking about, if we're in the tourism category, then thinking about New Zealand tourism and ATED and other partners across New Zealand and Australia in that space. The first thing we had to do and the last thing we had to do and everything we had to do was get up close to customers. And I have this sort of tripartite that I work to, which is I've got the customer and their desirability. What is it that they're into? What is it that they get up in the morning for and will open their wallets for? What is the commercial viability of that? So without actually business modelling, do we think it's a big opportunity or not? Do we think it's actually going to shift the wheel, whether it's a commercial or social impact? And then thirdly, what do we have in the way of infrastructure, assets and people that can actually help us get there? And if not, what do we need? So that's my kind of triangle. I come back to that at points across every project. So the landscape, and this is just going into some of the things that were driving the programs that I was introducing. So one of them is the millennial. And there's this view that millennials are like backpackers and students with no money. Well, the reality is that over half of them are actually earning above $80,000 now, and average age is 33. And by 2025, they're going to represent 75% of our workforce. So these are the holders of consumer spending in New Zealand and actually globally. Half their transactions, over half the transactions actually for everybody are on mobile now. And they're really disengaged from work. The loyalty factor is right down. And that's because they're actually looking for more purpose. And this purpose is actually driving a whole lot of consumerism as well in the way that they are actually consuming goods. They're showing up in body, but their hearts aren't there. And that's a real worry if that's 75% of our workforce. And technology is definitely changing us. I won't dwell on this, but it's big and it's fast and it's coming at us with speed over and over and over again. It's dropping the barriers to entry. So anybody, and particularly Fonterra and SkyCity both, we have huge legacy infrastructure. And if other people have no need for infrastructure, overnight they can actually come in and compete with us. So we're actually creating a crutch for ourselves by relying on this old infrastructure and trying to sweat these old assets when somebody else can come in. You know, if you were entering just about any part of the market today and somebody said, I'll give you $1 million, what could you do with it? You could do a lot. You could probably get your business up. So when we think about what we're reinvesting in terms of the core infrastructure, we really need to start thinking as if that competitor is going to step into our space. And the shared economy means that actually even consumers aren't looking at owning things. So owning houses, owning cars. One of the ones that I love most is the Uber flights. I can't wait, having living all north of Auckland, trying to get to the airport. Oh, that would just make my day. But you know, this whole notion of need for ownership is actually going to change the way that mortgages work, that car sales work, that just about, think about any asset. Even toys are being shared, which is actually wonderful because it's changing the way that people look after things. Because I'm looking after this toy so some other child can have it. I don't actually need to invest in all these expensive toys. We can have it as a shared physical piece, which is great. And it's changing what we eat as well. So millennials in particular are actually driving things like, you know, the no meat, but also so is climate change. So when we own some 27 restaurants in Auckland alone, you have to start thinking about, well, what do you put on the menu? What are people actually going to want to eat there? And how do we actually really think about how we're responding to these changes? Gamification, when we think about entertainment, you know, you go back to the old, the Pac-Man and things like that. Well, millennials have grown up through that. And so for them, entertainment is a whole lot more sophisticated. And it's really social as well in a lot of ways, in the way that groups get together and play and connect. And my daughter, who's 13, she doesn't talk on email, she doesn't talk by text, she talks inside games. That's how her communication with her friends works. And so you have to kind of pull her out of it and say, actually get a friend over and play. But it's like really play. But it's big business. And we know even esports, we think about rugby in New Zealand. 820,000 rugby union fanatics in New Zealand. Well, there's actually 610,000 esports fanatics in New Zealand right now. And it's under the radar because it's online. And so these are the sorts of entertainment experiences that are coming through at pace. And they're actually, you know, this is making the traditional sports and audiences for traditional sports are dropping away. So one of the things we've been looking at is how do you actually join these things together so that we can maintain our rugby and netball and all those wonderful things that we stand for internationally, that we actually start to, you know, keep these audiences. it's a bit of a conundrum. And actually one of the myths too is around age of online. The over 56s are the fastest growing online audience for games. And part of it's because they're bored. But the other part of it is actually, if you're going to live longer, you want your brain to work. You don't want dementia. You don't want Alzheimer's. So they're playing puzzle games. They're playing mental health games in terms of just helping to expand and keep things working well. And that makes sense to me. So that's entertainment. In-home entertainment is growing like topsy. We look at Netflix taking off. And then we look at Uber Eats and how, why would you go out if you can order in? And you can actually get a really great experience for you and your friends at home. I live in a suburb where restaurants come and go. It's because people entertain each other in their home. And it's really easy when you've got a great Netflix, you've got wonderful opportunities and games and things to play in the house and bring people over. And when we look at that landscape, it's big business. These are some of the competitors for SkyCity. These are some of the competitors in the entertainment space. And they really, these are just the ones, this is just the investments in innovation. So we have to really get on the front foot if we want to compete with this kind of money, this kind of investment. And the customers themselves, we might say, well, look, we've got a pretty good service. We're in the hospitality business. We do a great job. But actually, we're being compared to how people experience other services. So seamless, frictionless service in an Uber ride or in a Disney theme park is now the expectation on us, because that's what good service looks like now. And so we can't say coming in and greeting people is enough. We actually have to think about that whole frictionless service against what other offerings are in other categories. So first thing I did was actually put together a customer network, because you start with your customer. So I set up an online panel around each of the properties for SkyCity across New Zealand and Australia. The panel in Auckland's got about 2,000 customers on it now, and they are both engaged and non-engaged customers, and they are there to volunteer to actually help think up new ideas, to test ideas, to tell us if we're on the wrong track, and also to help us kind of take us into the new world, which is fantastic. And that's both physically as well as online. We have people coming in as well as answering polls and things like that. And so we work with our customers and also with our staff to say, take on a theme like, what does the hotel of the future look like? Let's fast forward 10 years and just imagine what that hotel might look like. What might food service look like in 10 years' time? And what might entertainment experiences look like in 10 years' time? When you start to dream and imagine, all sorts of things come out. And then you, together, play it back to today and say, well, actually, what are all the things that we could do better today? And when we mash those two things together, we're starting to see the gaps and the opportunities, and we can overlay that commercial arm as well. And we can also see then what do we need to start investing in. So we're thinking about also the data. How do we provide a more intuitive experience if we don't know you, to if we do know a little bit about you, to actually if we know you a lot. And that can manifest itself in things like you've made a dinner booking, the table's not ready, but we've got your favourite cocktail ready over the road. So that's starting to use data in different ways to actually then dynamically answer and provide better service and empower our staff as well. So whilst I wanted to get into real flash, amazing, big stuff, which was all new entertainment, our customers said, earn the right by delivering utility first. Solve the pain points first. And that was things like, if you've ever been in the Auckland SkyCity car park, I can't find my car. So, and a lot of staff have that problem every day as well. It's just something weird about the design of it. So it's getting those simple things solved first, which earn the right, but also help you to then get that back end sorted, because as we go through and we start, find a way, no queues, walk in and out without paying because it's already mobile managed, discover what's on, keyless entry, make a booking, order up from wherever you are. Those things are all wonderful, but as you go through the process of prototyping, you find all the back-end operational things that need to be fixed, or actually where there are efficiencies to be gained, and there were a lot. From all of these ideas and all of this work with customers, we created a scorecard and a framework for actually working out, because half the problem is lots and lots of people have really great ideas, but which ones do you actually invest in? Which ones do you take forward? So we created a kind of a scoring index, which helped us to understand desirability, but also some of the practical things around timing, how different it is from the competition, how easy would it be to scale across the businesses, and the compliance as well, like is it actually okay? Do we have to work on this? Is this something that we can do easily? And involving other parts of the business at that point, actually for input, helped us cover off any unforeseen things around legals or finance or team or operation, so that what we ended up prioritising were the things that were actually real. And this is the Tesla framework. Basically, on the left-hand side is your current customers, and then on the right-hand side is your current market. So if you imagine that 70% space is doing what you do today better, and so you plot about 70% of your resource and time and focus into that utility space. Then 20% is in the adjacent markets and customers, which is things that are quite simple and comfortable to get to. And then the breakthrough space is that right out there, quite different, quite uncomfortable. Now, whilst it's 70-20-10, the profitability and the returns and the impact are the reverse. So in the 70% space, you can only actually expect to get around 2 to 6% lift in terms of change, whereas in that 10% space is where you get the 1,000% unicorns. And also, generally, that 10% space costs less. In that 70% space, you're dealing with your current structure, your current legacy, your current infrastructure. So the idea is to spend a bit more time in that 20% and 30% space and just make sure that there's a balanced approach. We discuss this one a lot as a business, because theoretically, if you get it right, it goes from in the second and third tiers back into the core. So you're constantly driving a new core. So from there, the innovation program roadmap was established. So that's the culture of innovation, about ideation, about digitisation, about collaboration, revenue generating programs, optimising, removing friction and introducing whole new revenue streams, and then the future opportunities space, looking in those adjacent and new markets. Investing as little as possible, so running a lean prototype through minimum viable product approach, and at every point checking in on that customer commercial and capability piece. My version of minimum viable product was taking things through to implemented, so that way I could get into the operational issues. And as we know, probably in this room more than most, is that integration is the hardest thing. So actually taking it through, so implemented and working, and then you can scale from there if it's right. That's pretty key. And architecting for composable offerings. So instead of just an app, thinking about actually a structured approach so that the customer gets more richness in the singular experience rather than having to have multiple things that they download and play with. And then having a practical common sense approach to how you get there. Delivering really fast. These are some of the prototypes. Which is actually, find my car is really simple, just lift it off the kiosk, because we actually had this technology in the kiosk, but unfortunately when you're walking around trying to find your car, you can't carry the kiosk with you. So we had to just lift that information in and pop it in the mobile phone. Room keys, we've been prototyping actually avoiding having to go to registration, just go straight to your room. And then actually the opportunity to upgrade your room via mobile as you go. Service to me, ordering up as a prototype. And then thinking also about how that extends into other experiences through partners as well. And that then started this whole back-end dashboarding. So what we found actually was this dynamic understanding of the customer meant that we could provide much better services. And an example is host responsibility. So if a person was in one restaurant, had a bit too much to drink and had been told it's time to go home, and then they go upstairs and pop up in another bar, the alert's already there. So the moment that they come in, we can actually see them, and we can actually manage that service better, which is great because you can't tell sometimes what's been happening, and that's the power of that data in real time. And with the right foundations, then that can expand out. So, for example, thinking about wayfinding, connecting with the city's wayfinding, so that these things all mesh together. Starting to augment our call centre and working out how can we actually, from what we're understanding, what are the things that we can expand on and start to automate. Thinking about, extending from find my car to drive in and the barrier comes up automatically. So you don't have to think about tickets and things like that, which are just wasteful and also hard to find when you need it. Things like thinking about your hotel room instead of just accessing it. Can you preset the temperature in the right way and have the lighting how you last left it? So just a bit more intuitive to how you've actually behaved in the past, so that actually the service is thinking about you and on your behalf going forward. Thinking about partnering up. So, for example, instead of having to cart your bags around the city on the day that you're leaving, your bags could go straight to the airport, and then you're freed up to actually enjoy some more sightseeing before you go. So those are the sorts of things that then expand out from that core, getting the core right, and then expanding out. One thing that we were going to do and decided very quickly, it failed with customers, was putting chatbots in hotel rooms, thinking, oh, this will really help them with their tourist experience, but it's a bit too big brother. They can hear everything. Alexa hears everything. So, no, not a good idea. That failed. Last year I came to All of Government and was talking about the Wynyard Innovation Neighbourhood, which is a group of organisations that collaborate. I won't talk about that today, but one of the biggest things was the ability to benchmark ourselves against other Kiwi businesses and to see where we stood in terms of digital capability. And because we know digital is a key enabler, we wanted to find a way of understanding where are the gaps, and actually also in the manner of collaboration, if somebody else is doing it better, then let's have a chat with them and figure it out. So we went through and did this and found that a lot of us had big gaps actually. And what we found was, as a result of that, I was just talking before with a gentleman here who if we asked 7 people what digital means, you'd probably get 7 different answers. And that's because it's sort of grown up in pockets, and you've had marketing version, you've had tech version, you've had innovation version. We've got customers experiencing things in different ways and consuming digital technologies in different ways. So what we found was the first thing we had to do was actually get all the stakeholders together and form a steerco, and that was from across the whole of business. So we needed a kind of a coordinated approach, and then agree kind of what are the outcomes we wanted from digital transformation. And the first thing we had to do was agree a definition. So we ended up working, for the sake of having a definition, with the McKinsey enterprise configured to deliver maximum strategic and operational value from established and emergent technologies and associated shifts in customer behaviour and competitive landscape. It's a horrible definition, but what it does is allows us to actually break that out for all of the different components of what digital transformation means. And that allowed then the conversation across different teams to be had and the understanding of the expanse of digital to be understood. And then we went in, and I'm sure that these slides will be shared, so I won't go into the detail, but basically we had a look at kind of what were the critical success factors to get right, and what are the shifts that needed to happen for digital transformation. So things like, instead of digital being delegated to a function, it actually needed to be led from the top. Adaptive mindsets, a longer term view, a holistic approach. customer-centred, agile delivery, and thinking away from business casing to venturing. And then thinking about, what are the first things we had to do? We had to actually get the story right and all be on the same page. We had to get agreement on what our ambition for growth was as a business, like how fast did we want to go, and what were the reasons for that, and let's agree that up front. And then, let's embed those changes needed. And we actually did the prioritisation together as well, and that makes a huge difference because then everyone's understanding why we're doing what we're doing and can pass that down to our other teams as well. And the first thing and the last thing we found was it actually has to start with our people. It has to be about transforming our employee experience first and enabling them so that they could then actually be digitally literate, but also helping others once they're there. So it was about building those foundational capabilities and then re-engineering the business to support a digital future, looking at the back end, and then into our customers and looking at new segments and expanding the model. So that ran alongside of the innovation program, so I was running both, leading, but not owning both because none of it's really owned, it's actually all kind of owned by the business. And so the first piece was around digital culture and how do we actually build that? Co-creating a future digital culture and transformation, making it a necessity, thinking about our people capability, where were the gaps, and what would be the strategies to close them. And then what is the customer experience transformation, employee and customer, and then what are the technical foundations that sit in behind that. And so one of the first things we had to do was actually introduce Agile. And Agile was in pockets, and it wasn't working because it was in pockets. So what you do is you're running really, really fast, and then you come up against waterfall or business casing or a decision-making process which is not agile. And so we had to think about agile across our whole of business, and again, we had to actually agree what the definition is because the tech definition of agile is different to the innovation definition, to the business definition. So we had to come up with a singular, what is agile, and then start with training our executive. Because if you don't have your leaders understanding what agile is and taking an agile approach to decision making, nobody else can actually get very far. So we started there. And then we built a roadmap around it and introduced cross-functional teams into learning post the executive going through the training. And we actually ran the program in an agile way as part of the way I was learning through doing, which meant that at every sprint we could actually reprioritise depending on what we were finding, what was working, what wasn't working. One of the things around culture was the employee voice coming to life. And every time I walked around the business, whether it be Fonterra with the farmers or Sky City around and looking in behind the scenes, the staff actually see and know what's going on. And they've got ideas up the gazoozy. So it's really around how do you harness that? So we introduced a winning ideas program, which started in Auckland, then rolled out across the group, and then joined up the group. And so it was a combination of an online portal. We used Cridicity, but there's a whole bunch of applications out there. We sort of saw that one as kind of middle of the road, not over-engineered, not too expensive, could get going quite easily. And then I think the key to this, though, is not the actual... the portals are easy, the tech is easy. It's how do you get the ideas to the right person to make a decision or provide feedback and get that effectively back to that staff member in good time so that they feel like they've been heard and that they're inspired, because there's nothing worse than a great idea going nowhere and that sits in the ether and they get frustrated. So the process that sat behind that was bringing in ideas champions, literally had napkins in the cafeterias with write your idea down and post it. And then the ideas champions, which would rotate every 3 to 6 months. So my idea was you'd grow your champions. So I worked with HR. We identified 2 champions in each property, trained them up on, and gave them a really little budget, $50 a week. And they had the role of inspiring, getting ideas out, running little sessions on things like anything from name that smoothie to how do we get electric bikes in and things like that. Their power on the ground was keeping things moving and gaining that momentum, and then they were responsible for making sure that everything went into the portal. Now, in the back end, we had to then moderate so that the idea went to the person who was accountable for the decision for whether that idea would go forward. And the range of ideas went into a steerco each month as well, so that we had a catch-all in case something was feedback wasn't quite right. But that meant that if there was already a project on, we could go back to that person and say, hey, that's a fantastic idea. It actually fits with this project here. I've spoken to your direct manager and we'd really like you to join the team, or we'd really like you to be part of the testing, or we'll keep you posted on how that goes, or that's a great idea, we're not moving it forward for these reasons right now. Or actually, that's a fantastic idea. Can you take it forward yourself? And we want to second you to do it. So it just gives that, the decision and the moderation was actually the key on that. So far, in the first 6 months, 500 ideas, of which 10% were implemented. And the efficiencies and the win off the back of that is quite significant in itself. And it's gathering momentum. It's now across all of the properties. And what's really nice to see is that, Adelaide staff are actually solving themes for Auckland. And there's this conversation happening across the business. We set both hard themes, like we want to understand how to solve this problem, but also free for all. I've been thinking about the business and I've got an idea. So those are whole things together. We also started this digital kind of forums, finding the champions. Often what you find is digital capability sits in pockets. And in Fonterra, I had a guy sitting in Vietnam who was an absolute expert in social media, and also the back end of gifting, which is a big cultural thing there. I had the guy from Philippines talking to me about, I need some help. Can you help me with my social media strategy? So I thought, well, why don't these two just talk to each other? And so that then started this, and I implemented the same thing at Sky City. Joining up the teams and joining up the capability, and then helping them to just have the conversation. I don't need to be, and I can't be the expert in everything, but there's experts across the business. So if you find those champions and then join them up, make them a champion, give them accountability for helping others, they love it. And it's also an opportunity for them to demonstrate leadership. So Echo was the Sky City one, and it's actually one of the first things that helped us do was to get guidelines and best practice shared. We found that we had completely different processes, even for marketing, across different teams. And once they started putting their information online, they realised and they could sort it out. So we had two parts to it. One was the resource centre, that was closed, and so everything in there was approved and could be used by anybody. So that was great, just simplified the access. And on the other side was this kind of sharing and discussion centre which anyone could actually contribute to. So that combination of these things, if you're going to draw from the resource centre, you know that it's right, you know that it's accurate, and on the other side, you know that actually you can contribute thinking. And then, you can actually see who's in the community, and it becomes a bit of a chat session as well, with leaders and champions driving it. Because these things will die if people aren't inspired and motivated, and if they don't keep the conversation alive. So how did we do? Well, the programs for Sky City are all implemented, which is great. A lot of the connected experiences are ready to go. We actually acquired an esports company and introduced the E-Blacks into the tower. Which is exciting. So a lot of the actual, the program initiatives were all in place. The Winning Ideas program has gone from strength to strength. Collaboration is great, and I think the biggest thing is that the customer voice is at the centre of the business, and that conversation, even the board ring up and say, look, we're thinking about this, could you test it with the panel overnight? And you can. And that's fantastic to see that conversation happening at that level. But what did we got? In the spirit of continuous improvement, I got a auditor in and said, audit me. tell me how I'm going against best practice. And so yes, we got a pretty good mark in terms of focusing on meeting customer needs, collaborating, and responding to changing business needs. We did okay, and building that engagement across the organisation is quite hard. You have to work that much harder. Accessing data pools, well, we had a lot of work to do in that area, but what we did have, we were working with well, and targeting tangible benefits worked. But we really got the prioritisation and funding wrong, and I'll talk about why. We were just too slow for starters. The way we went about it was the innovation team was kind of leading and driving and bringing all this information and charging into the future, and the rest of the business was getting on with the day-to-day. And whilst they were involved, they weren't owning it. And that meant that we were too slow to start, too slow to validate, too slow to resource, and too slow to finish. 2 years is too long in this business. You have to get there much, much faster. We could not be a standalone. People talk about skunk works. The only reason that would work is if you're going to cut that umbilical cord between the two. It has to be embedded within the business. And we had separate KPIs. So mine was all around future revenue, and the rest of the business was about today. And that's just not going to work, because you can imagine we're all competing for the same resources. Our CapEx and OpEx structure actually rewarded short-term thinking, because remember I talked to you about, we looked at the feasibility, we looked at actually what could we deliver now, and the way that it was funded is you OpExed it through to MVP, and then it translated to CapEx when it was creating an asset. That leads to the type of behaviour that supports you to do the things that are going to succeed, because otherwise it bounces back into your OpEx and you're going to hurt. So that is not a good structure for innovation, because you need to be able to fail and you need to actually back some bigger risks. The growth fund was actually, we had a growth fund actually in both Fonterra and at Sky City. It was allocated on a first come, first served basis. So somebody else might have gone in and said, oh, I want to put in a bowling alley. And that's exciting. And then I go in and say, I want to buy an esports company. And it's like, oh, well, we're already funding this. So that's not a very good structure. When you say there's this pool of funds, you actually need to have a bit more of a plan around what are we going to fund and why. And that needed, therefore, an integrated view of innovation and digital across the business, and joining up the KPIs. Actually, IDC did a survey recently, and they said, look, 78% of New Zealand organisations don't have digital KPIs. So there's a good place for us all to start. Communication. We were talking the talk a lot, getting people together, showcasing stuff, but actually what we needed was a more formal way of communicating and showing how we were going, and a simple traffic light system would help to do that, just to share the progress and the process and the journey that we were on. So this was the revised process, and what you'll see is that there's a change in terms of ownership and funding, depending on what it was. Originally, I was responsible for the whole thing, but actually, when we revised it on the basis of the audit, you could see that innovation was around curation, not ownership, but also around the ideation and the prototyping, and that the business was involved in the rest. And I think that's really, really important, because then it can sit inside the business KPIs and you can resource for it as well. It doesn't become this nice to have, it actually becomes an imperative. The metrics had changed as well based on kind of what we were trying to achieve at every point. And we had to get the whole business together to decide what we were going to focus in on, and whoever's owning the benefit down the track has got to be a part of that prioritisation process. This sort of brought me to mindset, because you have all this wonderful buy-in, and you've got all these people who want to do it, and then it stops. And that's because of this whole culture of decision control, of hierarchy, of middle management, really good operators, but don't want to change. And, you know, this, in particular, I'm really worried about the 30 to 50-year-old age group. And because we've learnt functionally really, really well, and change is harder and harder, but actually this is the group that are going to be disrupted. This is the group that need to be able to move forward and be part of what's the change in the future of work. But everything that tells me here is that these are the challenges. This is where it stops. This is why it stops. Everyone's too busy to move. I have no idea how I'm going for time, people. Good. So if we want to create a jump shift, we need a new mindset. We're just too slow. We're too encumbered by our comfort zones and the way we've always done things. And I don't know how many of you have seen this backwards bike, but it's a great example of how we learn and how hard it is to unlearn.
I learned how to ride a bike when I was really young. I had learned a life skill and I was really proud of it. Everything changed though when my friend Barney called me 25 years later. Where I work, the welders are geniuses and they like to play jokes on the engineers. He had a challenge for me. He had built a special bicycle and he wanted me to try to ride it. He had only changed one thing. When you turn the handlebar to the left, the wheel goes to the right. When you turn it to the right, the wheel goes to the left. I thought this would be easy, so I hopped on the bike ready to demonstrate how quickly I could conquer this.
And here he is, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Destin Sandlin. First attempt riding the bicycle.
All right. So the faster I go, the better. Yeah.
I couldn't do it. You can see that I'm laughing, but I'm actually really frustrated. In this moment, I had a really deep revelation. My thinking was in a rut. This bike revealed a very deep truth to me. I had the knowledge of how to operate the bike, but I did not have the understanding. Therefore, knowledge is not understanding. Look, I know what you're probably thinking. Destin's probably just an uncoordinated engineer and can't do it. But that's not the case at all. The algorithm that's associated with riding a bike in your brain is just that complicated. Think about it. Downwards force on the pedals, leaning your whole body, pulling and pushing the handlebars, gyroscopic precession in the wheels. Every single force is part of this algorithm. And if you change any one part, it affects the entire control system. I do not make definitive statements that often, but I'm telling you right now, you cannot ride this bicycle. You might think you can, but you can't. I know this because I'm often asked to speak at universities and conferences, and I take the bike with me. It's always the same. People think they're going to try some trick or they're just going to power through it. It doesn't work. Your brain cannot handle this. For instance, this guy, I offered him $200 just to ride this bike 10 feet across the stage. Everybody thought he could do it.
No, you didn't understand. You didn't understand. So, this way. Okay. All right, that's like. All right, so whenever you're ready. Wait. No, you have to keep your feet on. Dude, all right.
You get the picture. It's really hard to unlearn, and naturally, particularly when we come under pressure, we go back to our learned state. And so mindset is really, really hard. You know, when you're saying innovation matters, ideation matters, disruption matters, and yet you've learnt this way of being. And I think that, honestly, I think that's the thing that's holding us back. I think that is the thing that's going to stop us and will stop us maintaining our momentum as well. So it starts with a culture of learning. And that takes executive level commitment. You cannot have your managers in the business not thinking differently because they will force that culture, and culture starts from the top, right? So you've got to set that scene and actually bring that different thinking into your workplace. So, you know, when you think about it, communicating the why, what don't you know the answer to today? Go and find out. You know, we spend too much time in meetings instead of actually in getting out there and understanding what's going on. Get that muscle memory working. And the best way of doing that is getting out of the office. And be role models and give that middle management the permission to do it as well. That's why I say it has to start above, because if you don't give them permission, they're afraid. Changing habits is really important. Calling out people who fall back on what they know, actually make it a thing. And, you know, like riding a bike, it actually takes practice. The chap in the video took him 6 months of practice to actually learn how to ride the bike the other way, and then he got on his old bike again and couldn't ride it. So yeah, it does take practice. It's not going to be a silver bullet, but it does take practice and time. So just sort of looking at some of the key things, core business and new ideas need to be aligned. You need to be aligned by purpose, working together with shared accountability, understanding each other is really important, and providing incentives, because if we're incented on delivering a project versus incented on an outcome, you're going to operate very, very differently. So I would say change the way you incentivise your staff. Put different business areas together. Let them dream. Don't put them together and say deliver this project. Put them together and say dream about an outcome. And then show how it aligns to what you're trying to achieve, and let them go on the journey and find the way. Everyone can innovate. I was with a recruiter a wee while ago, and they said, "Oh, you're not an innovator." I said, "Why not?" I said, "Oh, because you're not a young male with ripped jeans." And I fundamentally believe that every single person started out as a 10-year-old dreaming and thinking and imagining, and that has not gone away. We have just learnt by rote, and we have to unlearn. So bring people together and support that emotional and cultural intelligence to grow. Find the champions within, put them in charge, help them, challenge them to manage themselves. They're waiting for people to tell you what to do. Hold open pitch sessions for staff. Every Friday night, get a microphone and let people come and talk about an idea they've got. Great opportunity for young leaders to come through. Amazing opportunity to share, and also puts people in a vulnerable state, which is part of culture change as well. Create your own institute for the future. Bring people together and give them a challenge to come back and present. Make it cross-functional, never from one area, and create safe places to experiment where it's okay to fail, but what we call taking intelligent risks, which is not just going out there and doing anything, but actually thinking about the business, thinking about the core, thinking about doing things the right way. It's bigger than us, so we need to invite other people in. There's no way that anyone can specialise in everything today, so we have to get the ecosystem working and really think about desired outcomes together to maintain that momentum and speed. And no matter what business we're in, it's always about customer outcomes, whether they're social or commercial. Everyone in the business needs to get this, and if everyone in the business gets that and is rallied around that, the how will be a lot easier. And your customer will tell you how to win. They actually know the answer, so it's like cheating, really, in a good way. I'm part of the New Zealand Tech Leaders Exec, and we introduced some digital principles which we're challenging businesses in New Zealand to adopt. It's on the New Zealand Tech Leaders site, but it's some very simple things that we can all do. Be purposeful, seek to improve, actively collaborate, focus on value, be people-centric, and commit to lifelong learning. And if we can all adopt those principles, I think we'll put ourselves into a really good space. So just a couple of takeaways to finish up. Clear purpose and shared priorities will align us. Build innovation into the core of your programs, business programs, and curate it. Culture drives everything. We need to train ourselves to think differently. We need to challenge our leadership to change behaviours away from hierarchical towards more coalition and wider ecosystems, and encourage that mindset of agility and adaptability. Create contexts that help people, ideas and information to flow across different groups. Collaborate all the way, and try new models that will connect that ecosystem together. Start small with a vision for the future. Speed is super important, so it'll never be finished. It will never be finished. You can't ever tick the end of this project is completed box. So create a safe space to experiment and just get going. They call it, plastic brains of 10-year-olds. We all have to find that plastic brain again, imagine our future, and everyone can dream. Thank you so much for your time, everybody, and I'll look forward to talking to you over the next day.
Just thanks again. Thank you very much. There's a little present in there, including a hat with a pom-pom.
No, seriously, is there? I'll wear it.
Yeah, and we do have some time for some questions. So just looking on here, there's one about the presentation slides, and can people get them afterwards? But presume that's
Yes.
okay?
Yep.
So, there was a question here that struck me. How do you incentivise people to join your customer network? Pay them? How would this? What would that expense look like if there's 1,500 people?
Actually, people really value their voice being heard. So the way that I did it was you run a prize, basically. So the prize, often depending on what it is. So if I'm asking people to be just a part of an online moderation panel, they go on a competition for a prize, but often they're not there for that. They're actually there to have a say. So I think the value of the prize was something like $150 a month. It's not about big prizes, not about big money. People who are coming into restaurants to try out the walk-in, walk-out payment, they got a free meal to the value of $10. So you can manage it. Again, their satisfaction is about being involved. It's not about what's in it. It's not about payment. It's actually about shared responsibility for where the business goes. And customers, and particularly for government, your citizens feel very strongly. So that will be the scary thing. You'll have like a million volunteers.
So I think we've probably got time for a couple more. So one of the ones here that I think is really interesting. So
I'm not going with number 2.
I was just going to quietly go over that one as well. So what about non-digital customers? So the Minister's presentation about digital transformation, all that was really interesting, and what you've gone through and what you've talked through here. What about the people who don't want to engage, and actually not necessarily because they can't, but because they choose not to?
Yeah. So I was very careful for the panel to actually include non-engaged. And actually, because we're in the tourism side of things, we were looking at people who are from other countries who don't speak English very well either. And so I worked with the hotel to actually talk to travellers. And a lot of the work that came out of that was nothing to do with digital. It was all to do with process and understanding of culture. And language, and even, for example, a dining experience is very, very different. So that led to completely different partnerships and working with others in the industry around how do we join up and solve some of these problems together. But so it's not, I focused on digital because the theme was digital evolution, but the physical, and in fact I would say probably about half and half of what I was doing and implementing were solving problems that were not digital. It was solving customer problems and customer opportunities first, and then digital is employed if it's right and if it is an enabler. Yeah.
Right. So problem solving.
Oh yeah, problem is problem solving.
That's cool.
Yeah.
So another interesting question was that I saw in here was how do you maintain a focus? So there's a question here. How do you plan and innovate? We've answered these ones, but how do you plan and innovate for the future without losing sight of the now? And how do you maintain that tension between where you are and where you need to be?
That's why that's actually a really good question, the balance of today versus tomorrow. And that's where, to be honest, we cracked it a little bit because we had a board that was willing, that we had an understanding in the business that that's needed to happen. However, it was kind of like, well, you go off and do this while I keep today going. And the reality is that's never going to work because everything I was doing over here involved a change over here. And that's why the priorities for the business needed to actually, for innovation, needed to sit inside the business and be resourced by, it's not the money, it's the people. So to actually put it in as a KPI on the business meant that actually the business had a responsibility to innovate. And therefore, they were going to apply resources to it. And then I could curate and help that process, bring the consolidated effort together, look and recommend priorities, but actually at the end of the day, the business had to adopt and put it inside and embed it inside their programs. I think that's fundamentally where I went wrong. I thought I could operate out to the side and do all this wonderful stuff and bring it in, and I had really good support from the GMs. And even so, they were like, we'd love to help, but we are just trying to keep up with what we're doing today. So to make that shift, we had to actually shift these priorities into here and then give them the resources to be able to do that and support that process and support those GMs to keep the faith as well. Because a lot of these things weren't going to happen overnight. So you don't want to be putting hard targets on these guys. So just working together on it. Yeah.
I think we have time for one more. There is one on here that we can ask, but I did just want to give an opportunity if someone does have a burning question. Or should I go with the one on here? All right. So this one here is close to my heart because I see a lot of transformation and from people trying from the middle. So what were the key behaviours that the executive teams had to change? So that top level change, and how did that drive down?
Yeah, so executives definitely had to change the command and control, and that's really hard to do. So, if you think about the difference between a good manager and a good leader is actually thinking about a collaborative approach and helping people to help themselves rather than telling them what to do. So that's a fundamental shift, especially when you're in a business where process rules. And so that fundamental shift is around asking the question, giving the permission, empowering involvement and voice to come. So instead of saying to a manager, have you delivered this project by X, Y, Z? It's not actually, the conversation isn't about that. The conversation is about how are we going with that customer outcome? You're changing the language, you're changing the question, and you're more around the how are you going to solve this and what support do you need rather than do this, follow this. Because we're humans, we're not robots. And we've got brains and we need to employ them.
Yeah, absolutely.
I hope that helps.
Yes, yeah. So please join me again in thanking Sonya.
Pleasure.